That's like every day, probably. All right, so no forgetting recording. Welcome to the study seminar session. So we're going to walk through just a couple things on here. I'll be in the recording once in a while, but I'll also be kind of helping people since we have a good crowd. So if I step out for a while and you see that I'm clearly not in the shot and can't hear anything, if you're on YouTube, I'll try and edit that out. But if there's just a blank sequence for a while, you should either be doing something like on the worksheet, because I'll share the same PDF with you, or you can always tab over and 5-second me a bunch. Okay, so good thing is that we actually have a pretty good amount. This is actually kind of the ideal amount of people that I would have liked, because I did send it to a big listserv, but I was kind of terrified if too many people showed up. This kind of helps me out a little bit. So how many of you are looking for something in, what are the classes everybody's looking for? Is there something you have in mind specifically? What about biology 105, 106? Is anybody in those? Okay. So 106, 105, what about any chemistries? Anything like that? Any math? Anything? Okay, go ahead. Calc 1, okay. Hopefully this can help a little bit with that. I believe it can. All right, what other classes is everybody kind of targeting with this? Or you can kind of say just general. Just general, like yeah, okay. And that's where I learned this, so that's kind of how I feel like this is the best use here. So full disclosure, most of my training came at like a med center, which the way that educators work at a med center is those are typically doctors, nurses, other allied health professionals. There's a lot of info to cover in a lot of those sections. Most of the stuff we do today will be to show how to cover processes and a ton of info, and how connecting the pieces that you learn in class is going to help the most, probably. So easy enough. I'm a prof. We're going to yell at you first off right here. I don't think that if you're at this, you're really not checking any of these off. You wouldn't come to this if this was the problem, right? So in any case, you're attending all the labs, you do take notes. Do try and put your phone down. I'm as bad as everybody else about doing the phone, but in class, I promise things will not come across quite as well. The brain's very bad at shifting focus back and forth as much as I or anybody else would want it to be so. This is a big one right here. So we are going to do strategies, but there is one heavy duty strategy to always do a little bit better. The 7 hours is a lot. And like I said, being trained at a med center, that's the number that everybody's going to give you. How much per class are you putting in? Not everybody can do that in undergrad. That's okay. But that number should be in your mind at least if things are not going super well. Who finds 7 hours? 7 hours is okay, or 7 hours is like, oh my God, that's like way too much. You can give me a thumbs down. That's okay. Because I always want that impression for everybody. Because again, that's what was always given to me. So I was trying to at least scare everybody with that. So next one. Most of you will have profs that are willing to meet, hang out, look a little bit. If they have study questions that they give you, or even just guiding questions, just like, what part of the cell does this? Things like that. Go through those, find immediately the ones that don't make too much sense. That's what you target during office hours. One of the biggest things is, what do I talk to them about at office hours? If you bring like 5 or 6 of the guiding questions, be like, I'm lost on these ones right now, even after looking at the notes. That's the perfect starter for how those 15 minutes, 30-minute office hour sessions can be used. Okay. Last one, and this is not the easiest thing in COVID, studying in a group. If you do have friends, anybody that's been in the class or is in the class right now, even if it's your lab mates, give it a shot. It is tough to kind of say hey, do you want to study? Do you want to get together? Literally 2 brains always going to be better than 1 every time, because somebody's strengths can help other people's weaknesses in a lot of ways. And sometimes you'll be able to confirm what you guys know is right. That's the biggest thing, is when you study alone, do you really know every time that you're right about something, right? There's always those moments you're like, I really wish I could 9% confirm that, but I can't. Studying with that group can help that confirmation that you have. Okay, last one. And the reason I think that I'm okay at this is a lot of your profs are just straight up geniuses. I don't know how they did it, straight A's and everything. I had to really adjust in college. I would take notes, I'd attend everything. And who's ever done this? You go to class, you take your notes, maybe you rewrite your notes and you reread your notes a couple times. Who's failed an exam after that? I'm gonna raise my hand multiple times. Okay. Reading notes, not the way that you can pull everything off. Reading notes is very light, it's not very active. It's fine if it's hey, you got 10 minutes, let's say. Let's try something a little different here. So first step, for whatever class that you have in question, oh yeah, I can do this, sorry. For whatever class that you have in question, get me some material. whether this is coming up for another exam or something else, or you've already had this or been assessed on this. I'll let you kind of choose that. Think about one, not necessarily lectures worth, but at least like one conceptual like go, right? Trying to think like if this was 211 and this was genetics, you could say like all of Mendelian genetics, all those concepts. So harness that, see what you're looking for on that. And you can read ahead, obviously. There's some stuff that's going to happen here in a sec. But so find those notes. And those of you in the recording too, yeah. Find a section in there, somewhere in your notes, and this can be anywhere. Like I said, try and keep it like kind of in a connected section. That'll help what we're about to try. Okay, so what pieces did anybody find? Give me a couple examples. I know enough of you in here that some of you, yeah, Taylor and Megan, you can say stuff. It's okay. Everybody else can also say stuff. It's like, what section of the class are you looking at right now, Taylor, for your notes? Okay. Perfect. Awesome. Okay. So that's a good example of a single like segment, like a unit, right? The respiratory system, comparative anatomy. Perfect. There's a lot of stuff in there, right? It's a lot of notes. So everybody can kind of follow along here. After looking at those notes briefly, and I imagine you've reread these a couple times, maybe, right? You took them once, so at least that's one rep, right? The lesson what we're about to do is that repetition doesn't always lead to results. You can probably rewrite your notes one time and it's going to be pretty effective. Don't keep doing it. Try this. This is more of an active way and it's a little bit more of a stressful way, but I promise the results are a little more valuable. Okay. In this case, of that section that you had, what is that percent that you feel as though you know right now after reading through your notes? How confident are you? And go with your gut there, right? Like if you read that section and you read through everything and you didn't stop at any point, right? You should put a pretty high percent, right? So typically, what is that number? Like after rereading notes, where does that number usually lie? Notes that you feel pretty good about, right? Like you saw it in class, it made sense. The notes make sense, right? What's everybody's number in that? What range is that? It's going to vary between how people think about it and what section you're on, et cetera. So the numbers are definitely going to be different from everybody.
I feel like pretty good about it. I would say I'm at like 40%.
Okay. That's good. Okay. There's a 50. And you can like, you know, you can kind of mas or menos it too, like 40 to 60% somewhere in there. I'll just tag the middle. And if you want, think of a number that's more aligned with how you felt you knew your stuff before an exam happened. Remember how you usually feel pretty good after you're reading your notes right before an exam, right? That number's pretty high usually, right? Like 80%, right? Yeah, you've read your notes, feels great. Yeah. Megan, I'm gonna bump you up to 60 to make my point. It'd be good. Okay, so like 60, 80, 75%, right? It's like, yeah, it feels pretty awesome. I've read this, I've seen this. I'm definitely ready. But like we answered that first question up there, did that percentage match the score you got on an exam once? Not usually, right? One of the things that happens is that when a prof is going over stuff, it's like, oh, obviously that makes sense. Well, obviously that next step makes sense, right? But it's the way when we design questions that if we have a system, so let's say respiratory system, and we pull an element out of that and then say, well, now what happens? How do you apply that, for example, right? That's when notes can sometimes lose a lot of their confidence because we pulled away from the typical system. Okay. Next up, big one. This is the real thing. Put everything away. And if you need a blank sheet, I have one. But if you have a blank sheet of notes, you got nothing except the notes that you had in your head, right? So that was the section that you read. We were about 75% confident in that stuff, right? And everybody in the recording, you can do the same thing. Whatever that percent you had on that section, put all your notes away, get out that blank sheet. As you can tell, this is going to be tough. So, blank sheet, imagine that in this exam for whatever you are doing, just imagine for the class, you have a blank sheet for that whole section that you can bring into the exam. And you just get to bring it right in. Get everything you can get onto that paper. Everything you can get from your brain, put it down. Because the more you can put down right now, the more you're going to have on that exam, right? And that's kind of the scenario. Yeah. So I'll give everybody, it's usually good at like, we'll get a read on the room, but it's like 3, 4, 5 minutes, something like that. So here in the recording, you can use the minutes or you can skip ahead to when I come back. I'll tell you too on this, pictures help. You start to see how that starts building up a little bit. So I'm actually doing one too, as an example for something I'm doing. If and when you get to sections that you know are a step to the next step that you might know, just you got to put a question mark there. Be like, I don't know, I know like this third step, I forgot steps 2, for example, maybe. Just note that. Because the more you can put it down, even if it's out of sequence, it's still going to help this first one. All right, so everybody had a pretty decent stopping point, thumbs up, not too bad. Okay. Part of this test, it can partly be, and if you ever get into classes, clinical classes are like how I was trained, the tests do come pretty quickly. So part of this strategy becomes the speed at which you can rip that out. But at the same time, eventually you get to a point that you can't write fast enough for how you're thinking. But, okay, was the percentage that you thought you knew the percentage that you did know? So you can get your notes back out again. So did we hit that kind of that mean in there at like 75%, 70 in there? I'll let you look at those notes again that you originally took, which definitely use those as like the backbone of what we're going to do. And definitely don't be shy if you did actually hit 70%, that's okay too. So did anybody on the retrieval practice onto the page, did anybody hit 70%? Right. Don't worry. Now, did that feel good to not hit 70%, right? It felt bad, right? It was like, oh my God, how much of this I thought I was looking at and I didn't know. Psychologically, what's happening there is the brain is unfortunately making that realization. And this is like literally a cognitive thing. The brain hates being wrong. That stress that you felt is the brain kind of being taught a lesson in that point. Now, I'm not teaching that. Trust me, this happens to me. I literally listened to this podcast yesterday and I have a bunch of trash on here. So clearly I also could make use. Now, the big thing that you have, and this is all in the handout, there's a good side of this. The percentage that you were able to get down. Some people start at like 10, 15%, others at 30, right? You now know the parts that you know. I know that sounds redundant. You know the parts that you do know now. Because what the first little retrieval practice was for everybody, it's a bit of an exam before an exam, right? There's no stakes here. but it was the same environment, right? No notes. What can you give me, right? So yeah, give me like a spread. How big was the difference between what you thought you knew and what you actually ended up knowing? Not too bad, too much, etc. I don't know. I can't scale that, but
Like 30% off.
like 30, okay. So it's not bad, yeah. Never mind. Okay, wait. So more than 30, which is okay. Who had, yeah, so upwards of 60%, like, oh my God, I didn't know half of what I thought I knew. That's usually how these start. You typically start at about 20%. Now, imagine if you just kept reading your notes on that section over and over, and it's like, that makes sense, let's do this, right? That's the 20% you would have brought into the exam right there. So there's multiple things that we can identify here. So like I said, the stuff that you did know down there, be really confident in that. That's your anchor. That's the stuff you are so confident in now because you pulled it out right away, right? But you also know, let's say, the 80% that we didn't know, right? Now you can go back in your notes. You can use that backbone. Get the other color out, fill in the gaps that you severely missed on those retrieval notes. So now you have your regular notes, get that study guide out. New color though, to indicate this is the stuff I was not quite there on. Do the same thing. I'm gonna have to look up all the stuff that I missed. Yeah, first things first. So these get built in kind of this 1, 2, 3 punch sort of stage. You read your notes, you give it a shot, you fill in the gaps. And the gap filling with a new color pencil, and I do have a couple pencils up here for pens that are different if anybody wants one. But visually what we're doing with that next color is you're cementing in your brain, okay, this was the stuff that did not come through the first time. This is the stuff to think about a little harder. This is maybe the stuff to bring up to a professor at an office hour, right? We're sort of creating that content for ourselves like this. Yeah, I think for my personal try that I had, I think it was like 40% or something. So I was actually kind of disappointed. Yeah. Okay. So maybe everybody's is kind of going to look like mine. A lot of red. I had to fill in a lot of gaps. I missed quite a bit, unfortunately. So using this, identified the stuff that I knew I was right on. That's good. So what that does is build confidence in that section for you. From now on, you can always use that to jump to the next piece. But it does also show me here's the stuff that I didn't see. The technique behind this too is to show you how far away, how many degrees of separation are you on the stuff that's red from the stuff that you were confident in, right? Some things will be several degrees away, that's okay. But a lot of this is just like one thing away, right? Like I was one piece away from having it, from that unknown. Let that confidence build too. And the way, and I'll tell you this too, and I think I mentioned in the handout later, the human brain's very, very, very good at associating something that it knows about with something new. It's very bad just trying to do I'm just going to learn this whole new thing. So the more associations you can build between things, the better. I'll take a little break from this to show you what I mean by that too. So when you're studying, and you can do linear down the page notes if you want. This is another way to study once you kind of consolidate a lot of material. So I'm going to use a genetics example. Sorry, hopefully it's okay. But if I want to know the differences between DNA, RNA, and proteins, if you set up this XY matrix like this, right, you're going to start to be able to see how things are different and how they're the same. So this is kind of a little sidetrack before we revisit the retrieval practice. You'll see why. So anytime you're taking notes and you do have things that are close enough to be related like this, the best example of this is going to be human diseases, where you're going to have disease 1, 2, and 3. And it's all right, tell me what all these are. Over here, you could have, I probably should have done that. You could have symptoms, cause, treatment. And instead of a downward spiral of notes where it's each section is kind of this unrelated looking thing, you're going to start to see that, oh, look at these conditions are actually pretty similar to one another. More importantly, finding differences between two things that make them opposites, that's a much better way to learn than it is just saying piece 1, piece 2, piece 3. So the more that you can label up and find differences between things, the better. / cytoplasm, sorry. Those of you that had me in class know that my handwriting is it's a work in progress. And one of the best ways that these can actually be used is that you can typically start utilizing the fact that pictures are a much better study tool typically than just notes. So matrices that's a quick and dirty way to show you that's another kind of quick trick to make these a little faster and a little more efficient. That box right here is going to take up a lot less room. It's going to be more efficient for me to compare and learn between the 3 things than if I was just, here's DNA, here's RNA, here's proteins. This is a small example because ran out of room on the thing, right? Okay. But what we did just now, that retrieval practice, you can also just think of this as aggressive note-taking. Was that not a little more active than reading through the notes, right? Yeah, but it did bear a lot more, did test you a little bit, right? And that's what you want before an exam. You do want that feeling to come through, because every time that you make one of these and you do get that stuff, you're gonna know that it's right. If you just reread your notes, it might be right, you might be wrong, right? We've all been through that. We raised our hand on that. So where do we go from here? Keep your backbone notes with you. Keep the PDFs from class with you. You will still keep using those. The next step that you would do for these sections is you're going to try it again. We don't have to do that today, because it usually is going to be best cognitively if you wait at least 30 minutes to an hour before trying this again, right? You're going to try and pull this out, same thing. Let's say in an hour if you wanted, the class that you're studying. All right, you remember you would look through this section right here, highlighting the regions that did not go well that first time before you actually start the next one. And then whenever you're ready, go again. And again, it is difficult. That's why it's but why it's a very effective way to study, especially in like clinical sciences where you have a ton of info running around all the time. Now, the reason that it's going to start building and that percentage that you ended with this first round, that starts to climb. And typically you can get to a study guide that climbs and you hit like 85%, boom, on. And the minute that you get to like 80%, 85%, what I do is I'd actually start trying to make like a book of these, like a book of study guides of your own notes that you made without the backbone almost, okay? We can always have a few sections that are still coming from backbone notes before the test, but that gives you something very small and a good window to focus on, right? And the biggest thing is that I promise that you're not memorizing these steps. The way that this cognitively is going to work is that the first thing you're going to go for the next time you try and fill one of these out likely is going to be the stuff you already filled out easy the first time, right? That's going to rip out. And then the stuff that it was now connected to in red, hopefully one more step comes through with each of these. And that's sort of the plan. So give it a shot, because typically people are a little scared of trying it one more time. We don't have to do it today, but do it. You can try it later today, maybe. And that'll be a good timing to see like, okay, did I improve that percent just a little bit? And if you did, that means that you're ready to test percent is higher every time, because that's what these are going to be. Okay. And yeah, I mean, I always try and stress this. Anytime you have a way to connect something to what you didn't know, to what you do, that's the best way to study. Okay. So 4 is kind of the final like section on retrieval. It's just saying like, here's kind of the step-by-step for these. And eventually, and if you have it like labeled, you can do the date, you can do the version and the subject that you're doing. Eventually you start, if you keep these enough, you start to see the progress that's being made. And that's a very cool thing to see. You can't do that by just rewriting notes or rewriting lectures, right? You start to see the amount of red sink away from the pages. Again, like I said, it's definitely a harder use of that time, but it is a far more efficient investment. So if you're okay with that, there's always times to reread your notes. Like if you got 5 minutes before bed and you're like, I'm just gonna take a look, that's fine. But if you have the time and you got that dedicated couple hours in the library or somewhere else to study, that's how you can for sure make it worth it. Okay. So last bit. As you start making these really good though, and like things start like flying off the major contents there, and by major content, I'd also make sure, do your best to, so you probably have, everybody has slides of stuff in here from your profs where it's like, we post an image on there and we explain the image, right? With the guides, and this seems like an extra step, but I promise it's not. If you got an image of a process or an organ or something, try and start bringing that onto here. That's kind of one of the last steps of that 80%. And the reason why is that, and even if you don't do full-on retrieval practice, try and make sketches of what you see in your notes from the PDFs and the PowerPoints your own though. Because one of the worst things that happens is that by seeing that you have a PDF of an image or a process, you start thinking like, it's fine, I won't need it on the test. Do your best to retrieve those a little bit, because those make your own images and annotate them on your own. I promise it just like takes you to another level with image-based stuff. But as you start making these versions of notes that are like far more aggressive, far more efficient, you can get out a third color and you can start adding things that are more personal. That is like, hey, for Mendelian genetics, the way that I think of this is like the curly hair mutation in dogs is dominates every time. I'm going to do this up here as a little small example, like up here. So on the margins of these little sheets, you can start making, like in blue for my case, like personal examples to whatever field you're interested in, let's say. And what this is going to do is you're going to learn a little bit by example, by searching through and saying and finding stuff. But you're also going to tie material to things that you care about and you know. Those of you that have had me in genetics, you know I'm a big dog person. So I teach by a lot of examples. That's okay. You can also learn by example too. The more examples that you can tie to, it's going to be a lot easier on the exam to remember, okay, this is the gene that determines coat color in mice, and I'm a big mouse person. I don't know if there's that many mice people around, but it's okay. The more stories and examples that you can personally draw and annotate, kind of like how we have in here, the better. And this is kind of that final stage to get to. And that's the reason that like sort of that black and white content on the page that you want to master up to 85, 90%, that final stage is like kind of turning it into your own stuff. And the examples are one way to do that. Your profs will give you a lot of examples. The textbook has a lot, but if you want to Google stuff, you'll probably find something interesting. You can use that as the anchor. Okay. And I kind of go through this on 5 right here. So the more that you can tie this to something you care about, far better every time, because you can always have that thing you care about. It's always going to be an anchor for your brain. And if you have 1 to 2 degrees away from something you didn't know before is connected to that, you're going to be in great business during the exam, because you'll see something and it'll be like, okay, this is my example. Let's go. This part, although I introduced it latest, this is how I started kind of surviving college a lot better. Was I had to teach myself the material through an example every time. I eventually ran into profs that taught quite a bit more by example, but if I didn't have one, tying in something specific to whatever we were doing, that's how I started to raise that GPA up a little bit, to say the least. And I kind of touched on this too, is that brain's very good at connecting to what it knows. You have pieces in every one of your classes that you know, backbones that you can spring forth from and get all the ancillary stuff that at first, the first time you saw it, maybe you didn't. But as long as you've got something that you can always fall back on, you're never like 2 to 3 degrees away in your notes from just about anything in a class, hopefully. Some profs bounce around. I hope I don't do that too much. Okay, so the annotation for 5 is something called Fineman Technique, if you want to look it up a little bit. I mean, there are good YouTubes about it, how to do it. But that's all it is just making sure that in the margins, you have your own thoughts kind of guiding the way your examples and your studying can go. Okay, so last thing, and I'll stick around and we can kind of cover, if anybody wants to stick around, I'll see like what that transition was and I'll kind of coach you up on those, but it's your time. Last thing is, and it's such a goofy thing because this is definitely like, it's definitely a strategy that can be used even in like high school, middle school and everything, but I'll let you kind of read through it. It's just a 3-3-1. Those 5 minutes after lab or lecture ends, everybody's scrambling to get out, and all the noises and the backpacks and everything getting up makes everybody anxious. Don't leave. You got those 5 minutes. Do a miniature, what do I remember? You don't have to do the whole notes. Just say, here are the 3 things that were really easy from today. And don't look at your notes. Here's the 3 things that after maybe looking at my notes, not so hot on still. And then I always throw in the final one. The one is just, what was something cool today? That's it. Kind of helps. Like if you have that one for each class, you can always go back to that idea. But what these are good for is finding those anchoring pieces before you start the big retrieval practice so that you know kind of where you're going to begin from. And you don't have to write notes just all the way down like I did in this case. You can start from the middle and like spread out too, however you want to do it, however you want to basically be an architect for these, that's going to be better for you. And on the picture side, some people are better illustrators than others and want that. So that's kind of your call out on how you want to use those. But the example is pretty fun though, honestly, right? Like who's ever had just like some crazy dream and you're like, oh my God, like that's crazy. I'm gonna totally remember that. And then like 6 hours later, you have no idea what it was, right? That like always happens. So unless you write it down. So that's why 3-3 reflection is such a good thing. And again, all this also builds into, here are the conversation starters that I'm going to bring to the prof during office hours. Here are the 3 things from this class that like, I'm not cool on yet, even after looking through the notes. And that's how you can kind of identify that. Because I think it can be intimidating to go office hours like I did for Orgo. And I was like, I'm just straight up lost on orbitals. I don't know where to start. It can be intimidating. Profs will help you from that point. But if you identify the pieces that you need, it's going to be a lot more efficient for you. And you'll take away a lot more from those 15 to 30 minutes. Okay. Last one, and it's not on here. It's always a bit of more of an aggressive strategy. It's a different style of taking notes. So like this is totally off the cuff because I don't always recommend this. This is like if you need a full-on change, instead of taking notes during class that are just like, here's what's happening, only write down your questions. Write down all the stuff you don't know after what somebody just said. It's like, wait, where does that come from though? Why is that related to this though? And if you want, and if you're fast enough, you can have questions in the margins of your notes built in as that person lectures in a different color. It's kind of the final one. That is something called know what you don't know. And it's kind of a step ahead on doing the retrieval practices. It's a very aggressive strategy though. It's not for everybody because you're going to have to be shifting between, if you want to take regular notes, and off here in the margins, you have to be getting those questions down as you have them because you will forget them later. Okay. So yeah, I kind of want to open it up. Did everybody feel okay? It's been 40 minutes of me talking. So yeah, I typically share these with students. It's kind of a crash course in it. And this is the first time I'm doing this like study seminar too. So I'm taking my own notes on how to improve and et cetera. But definitely want to open it up now. I'll actually kind of try and bounce around today too. So officially, I'd say we're definitely done. I'll come around today if you want and look at how your notes look, answer any questions, and kind of see personally how you're doing in class and if there's any specific strategies I can share maybe. So, all right, sounds good. I'll actually end the recording in here.